Hi, and welcome to the first of four reflections for Advent, which are my contribution to a broader set of resources that we've brought together from our churches across our NWBA community. And I hope that together, therefore, we can spend some time reflecting on the meaning of this season of Advent, which I would want to say is something far more than how it seems to be increasingly portrayed in our popular culture as simply a frenzied countdown to Christmas. It's a season to recognise why we can remain assured of God's good purposes even amidst difficult and challenging times. It's a season when we can acknowledge that sometimes life can be tough, which I sense is a pretty important thing for us to consider at the moment. Churches will often mark the Sundays of Advent by lighting Advent candles, adding another each week until Christmas comes. And the first of these is often called the candle of hope, because Advent is a season of hope. And by hope, we mean something more than mere optimism. You know, whenever we go through a difficult or a test in time, people will inevitably say, "I hope things work out for you," or "let's hope for the best." And statements like that are really appreciated because they tell us that friends and colleagues really do care. They're standing with us in the struggle. But if we're honest, sentiments like that say more about human emotions than the likelihood or reality of things actually getting better. If things are tough and we are facing real difficulty, then it's the most natural thing in the world to hope that they will improve. But we've got to be honest with ourselves. Hope alone won't make things better. It's what we put our hope in that matters. And the kind of hope that we talk about in the season of Advent is not a hope that merely has its foundation in human emotion, but rather in God's purposes. The New Testament book of Hebrews speaks of this as a hope that is steadfast and certain. In fact, we can look at that for a few moments through the words of Hebrews chapter 6. And I'm just going to read verses 19 and 20. "We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner Jesus has entered on our behalf. He has become a high priest forever." Now, as the name of this book suggests, Hebrews is a New Testament letter written particularly to people with a Jewish heritage, seeking to help them understand how the traditional narratives of their religion and culture were fulfilled through Jesus. And it kind of does that by looking in two directions, by looking forward to the future, but also by looking back to the past. And in many respects, that's what we're also invited to do during the season of Advent. We look back to the coming of Jesus as a baby in Bethlehem, and we also look forward to the time when human history will reach its final consummation and Jesus will return as King. And one thing that we shouldn't overlook is that those historic events that record the birth and the life of Jesus are not just history in themselves, but the fulfillment of history, a history that preceded and predated Jesus' birth, a history through which God made repeated promises that one day a saviour would be born, a saviour who would not simply be the saviour of their nation, but the saviour of the world, a saviour who would not so much establish an earthly kingdom, but one who would open the doors for each of us to God's eternal kingdom. Now, even if you didn't manage to follow all of that, the underlying point is really quite straightforward. Jesus' arrival in this world is recognized by Christians as a tangible declaration that the promises of God are utterly reliable and the purposes of God cannot be thwarted. And that's why we can describe Advent as a season of hope. The candle of hope that I referred to earlier is sometimes described as the candle of our ancestors. And the reason for that is that its purpose is also to remind us to look back in the early narratives of our scriptures and to recognize through the stories of the ancestors of our faith that God made promises that we can recognize as now having been fulfilled. And this is another key theme in the book of Hebrews. Just a few chapters later, in chapter 11, there is a famous catalogue of the great and the good, all of whose stories can be found in the early books of the Old Testament. Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and many, many others. And what they have in common is that each of their lives forms part of a bigger story, that God's promises are consistent and God's purposes are fulfilled. That's the big story. And many of those people were far from perfect. Their lives were messy and littered with mistakes, but each of them are part of a story that finds its earthly climax in a manger in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. And so when we speak of being a people of hope, we're not simply connecting with this natural human emotion of wanting to believe that things can only get better when we're going through the mill, so to speak. We are a people of hope because we are a people with a history through which God has revealed his faithfulness and good purposes time and time again. And we recognize that the coming of Jesus into the world was the ultimate marker of that reality. As the words of one Christmas carol put it, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in the events of that night. But the book of Hebrews doesn't just draw on the history and heritage of God's people. It also draws on what we might describe as their theology. Because the promise of God was not simply fulfilled by the events of our past, but it will be fulfilled in the future. After all, if everything that we hope for is located in the past, then that's not hope, it's sentiment. And what the writer of Hebrews wants to assert, along with many of the other writers of the New Testament, is that the earthly Jesus may be revealed to us through the stories of the past, but the Jesus that we serve is the Jesus of our future. And God's people, to whom this letter was written, were all too aware of their shortcomings. Their God was a holy God. And just like all of those characters that I've listed before, and in fact just like us, they lived flawed, messy and mixed up lives. And if they were going to spend eternity with a holy God, they needed to do something about those flawed and messy and mixed up lives. And that was why they had their priests, those who could call them together in great assemblies of worship, where they would make sacrifices as a way of making right the wrongs that they'd done. And only those priests could make those sacrifices, and they could only make those sacrifices after a thorough ritual of cleansing themselves. And only those priests could enter the holy place, pass through the curtain that marked the threshold into God's holy presence. And we have a priest, says Hebrews, a high priest, from the highest order of priests. And that priest is Jesus. And he has gone before us into the holy place. He has entered into God's eternal presence. But he is our forerunner. He's left the curtain open, so to speak. He's marked out a way so that each of us can one day find our own way into God's eternity. And that's why we're a people of hope. Because whatever happens on this earth, we have a place that is secure in God's eternity if we put our faith in Jesus. Now, some of you may know that I am a football fan, or a soccer fan if you come from the US of A. And I'm a particularly happy football fan because the team that I support won the English Premier League last season. And not only that, but they won the league by quite some distance. In fact, they'd won the league well before the league season was over and all the matches had been played. And I'm not just using this as an excuse to kind of revel in their success, because I find within that quite a useful illustration. By the time the last game of the season came to be played, the title was already won. And now that didn't mean that they didn't enter that game with a very real hope of winning. It didn't mean that all of their fans did anything other than hoped that they would win. That's the kind of hope that we might all have. We always hope for the best. We always hope that things are going to work out the way that we'd want them to. But as we entered that game, we had another hope. A hope that in many respects was completely unreliant on the outcome of that football match. Whatever happened that afternoon, the title was secure. We had a hope that was an anchor, safe and secure, to quote the book of Hebrews. And that hope wasn't rooted in the fact that we wanted to win more than any other team, or even that we deserved to win more than any other team. That hope was rooted in the fact that we already knew that a bigger battle had been won. And that's the kind of hope that we are affirming during the season of Advent. We may yet have some difficult games to play. And of course, we wish only the best for one another in terms of human circumstances. Of course, we're going to approach life with a degree of optimism and desiring for things to turn out well. What reasonable human being wouldn't hope for all those things? But we have a hope that is rooted in something far deeper than that. A hope that is rooted in Jesus, because Jesus has prepared the way for us to follow into God's eternity. A hope that we can believe in, because we can look back at history and recognize how time and time again, even when things at the time seemed to be difficult and challenging and confusing, God's purposes prevailed. God's promises were fulfilled. And so we don't make this statement lightly or glibly, but we can say it with certainty. Even though our world is racked with uncertainty and struggle, even though there is so much happening that gives us just cause to be concerned and upset, whether or not things work out over the next few months in the way that we desire or expect, we have a hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Because Jesus, who came in fulfillment of God's promise, has gone before us to secure our place in God's eternity. And so may God help us all to live as a people of hope, even in these troubling times.